This video is brought to you by Dollar Shave Club. Support this show and our super long videos by getting started with Dollar Shave Club today. You can get a shave starter set for just $5. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/biographics. More about that in a bit. For now, let's get on with it. On November the 22nd, 1963, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald fired the shot that would change history. As crowds cheered on Dealey Plaza, the former Marine sharpshooter put a bullet through the head of America's telegenic young president. It was the first successful assassination of a US president in 62 years. But Oswald, he didn't live long enough to celebrate his grim achievement. Not 2 days later, Oswald would be dead too, killed by an assassin's bullet while in police custody. It's a story you've doubtless heard many times before, but it's only a fragment, a single chapter in the vast and messy novel of Lee Harvey Oswald's life. Born in 1939 to a New Orleans widow, Oswald was a man who tried his best to live a life of adventure. He enlisted in the Marines, he defected to the Soviet Union, he flirted with spies in Mexico City, but it was a single shot fired in Dallas that would cement his place in history. Join us today as we explore the life of America's most notorious assassin. When Lee Harvey Oswald opened his eyes on October the 18th, 1939, he had no way of knowing he'd just been born into a world paralyzed by tragedy. Not 2 months earlier, the boy's father, Robert Oswald Snr, had died of a heart attack, leaving his heavily pregnant wife, Marguerite, to look after their 2 sons. These dire circumstances may explain the dislocated early life that baby Lee experienced. In 1942, Marguerite sent Lee's older brothers away to boarding schools. She tried to drop Lee at the local orphanage, but was told that he was too young. Undeterred, she simply waited a year and then had him admitted. And so began the incredibly depressing childhood of Lee Harvey Oswald. For the next few years, young Lee bounced around between orphanages, relatives' homes, apartments Marguerite managed to briefly find and just as quickly lose. Well, you name it. In 1952, when the boy was 12, Marguerite even took him with her all the way across the country, as far from the bias and old colonial piles of Louisiana as she could. She took him all the way to New York City. But if Ma Oswald was expecting these streets in the Bronx to be paved with gold, she soon got a dose of cold, harsh reality. Life in New York City was hard. Marguerite took a job at a dress shop, but it required her to work back-breaking hours in which her young son was left to his own devices. As a consequence, Lee Harvey Oswald entered his teenage years lonely and rootless, spending long, listless days kicking his heels at the Bronx Zoo or aimlessly riding the subway. Technically, he was supposed to be in school, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the truant officer who picked him up one day in 1953. By this point, 13-year-old Lee had moved over 20 times in his short life, usually after Marguerite's latest job or latest relationship blew up in her face. The boy was surly, withdrawn, prone to violence. He even sometimes threatened others with a pocket knife. So rather than just caution this wayward child, the truant officer sent him to a psychiatric facility. There, Lee was found to suffer from neglect, but no actual mental illness. He was just another directionless kid with too much time on his hands and no one to love him. But while the love situation wouldn't change, Lee's life was about to get a whole lot of direction. On June the 19th, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by electric chair at New York's Sing Sing prison for handing US secrets to the Soviets. The execution galvanized New York's leftists, who campaigned across the city in the weeks leading up to the execution, handing out leaflets. One of those leaflets made its way into the hands of teenage Lee Harvey Oswald. For the first time in his life, the boy encountered socialism. As the Rosenbergs' bodies were quietly buried, Lee started reading books on socialist thought. It was an observation that survived even his next major move. In 1954, Marguerite abandoned New York City and dragged her son back to New Orleans and an apartment on Exchange Alley in the French Quarter. Today, the French Quarter is famous as a tourist hotspot. In 1954, though, Exchange Alley was the seediest part of a seedy city, crawling with pimps, prostitutes, and mobsters. Lee even had a connection to the local mafia via his uncle, Charles Murrett. It was a world that Lee couldn't wait to escape from. In 1955, the teenager applied to the Marines, lying about his age, but he was found out and rejected. A year later, at age 17, he tried again, and this time he got in. In 1956, Lee Harvey Oswald officially became a member of the United States Marine Corps. He likely hoped it would be the start of a new chapter in his life, a way to escape his problems. But when your problems are as deep-rooted as Lee Harvey Oswald's were, escaping them is easier said than done. So here's the thing about joining the Marines if what you really need is a place to settle and call home. The reality is it's not going to happen. No sooner was his training complete than Lee Harvey Oswald was shipped off to Japan before being shipped off to the Philippines and then back to the US. Yep, it was his wayward childhood all over again, only now the weapons he carried were bigger than a pocket knife. While in the Marines, Oswald managed to gain certification as a sharpshooter. He also developed an interest in banned weapons, an interest that got him in a lot of trouble when his forbidden pistol accidentally discharged and wounded him. The discovery of Oswald's pistol led him to be court-martialed, which led him to be court-martialed again when he got angry and attacked the sergeant who was court-martialing him. The sorry debacle ended with Oswald spending time in the brig. When he emerged, he was more bitter than ever. That's not to say Oswald's time in the Marines was all a disaster. The young man, he continued to study Marxism and he learned Russian. He even began preaching about Marx's ideals to his fellow Marines. And a note to any drill sergeants out there, if one of your Marines suddenly starts being all pro-Soviet in the middle of the Cold War, it's totally okay to tell the FBI. Oh, and that definitely goes double if you happen to be living in 1959. That's because on January the 1st of that year, Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government and installed the first communist dictatorship in the Americas. We don't know precisely how Oswald reacted to this news, but we do know he intensified his efforts with his Russian. By now, a clear plan was forming in the young Marine's mind, a plan that would help him escape his problems once and for all. On September the 11th, 1959, Oswald got a hardship discharge from the Marines. Just 9 days later, he boarded a boat to Europe, where he intended to apply to a Swiss college. He never made it. The moment Oswald reached England, he boarded a flight to Helsinki. There, he applied and soon got a Russian tourist visa. On October the 16th, 1959, Lee Harvey Oswald officially crossed to the Soviet Union. Barely had the ink dried on his entry stamp than he declared to his Russian guide that he wanted to defect. Thanks to spy movies, we tend to imagine the Soviet authorities were always on the lookout for Americans willing to go red. In reality, it didn't quite work like that. Oswald wrote to the Kremlin telling them he wanted to defect. The Kremlin took one look at his application and were all like, we're good. The rejection, it hit Oswald hard. On November the 21st, the day his visa ran out, he slit one of his wrists in his hotel bathtub. In hospital, Oswald was again interviewed by the KGB. Again, they decided he wasn't defector material. So Oswald, he forced their hands. On October the 31st, the newly discharged Oswald stormed into the US Embassy in Moscow and declared he was going to surrender his citizenship. Worse, he was going to tell the Kremlin everything that he knew about US radar codes. In the minor storm that followed, the Kremlin reluctantly agreed to reopen his case. On January the 4th, 1960, they finally approved Oswald to defect to the Soviet Union. When he got the news, Oswald must have felt like partying. Finally, it had happened. He had found a way to escape his overbearing mother, to escape his wandering, to escape his American life. Now he would have a place in this world at last, a home to call his own, a home known as Belarus. Wait, what? Well, on a freezing cold January day, Lee Harvey Oswald was ordered away from glamorous Moscow to the grim grey streets of the Belarusian capital of Minsk. Rather than a fresh new start, the move would soon turn out to be a horrendous mistake. If you've never been to Minsk, and we mean it with all sincerity when we say lucky you should know it's a city that will never win any tourist awards. Rebuilt in a cold Stalinist style following its total destruction in World War II, Minsk is Kiev without the charm, Chisinau without the nightlife, Warsaw without the edge. Stepping off the train there in the dead of winter in 1960 must have felt only slightly less depressing than stepping off the Styx River into the underworld. Still, Oswald's new life, it wasn't without a certain charm. Minsk in 1960 wasn't a city that was used to seeing Americans. The moment Oswald arrived, he was treated like a celebrity. Not only that, the Kremlin gave him a luxury apartment, luxury by USSR standards, and a plush job making radios. With all this adulation, it was kind of easy for Oswald to forget what a precarious position he'd put himself in. It's kind of easy to pretend his Marine discharge being downgraded to undesirable might not cause him problems in the future. It was only after about 6 months, when locals were used to him and the novelty of defection had worn off, that Oswald realized that he was now living in a boring foreign city with nothing to do. It probably didn't help that the KGB was openly monitoring Oswald's entire apartment. It was bugged, and informants watched his every move. By February 1961, Oswald was writing in his diary, "My work is drab. The money I get has nowhere to be spent. As my Russian improves, I become increasingly conscious of just what sort of a society I live in." Barely a year after he had first arrived in Minsk, Oswald began petitioning the US and the USSR to let him return to America. But the America that existed was not the same as the one Oswald had left. The previous November, a telegenic young man had narrowly squeaked home to victory in the US presidential election. Known as John F. Kennedy, he was the youngest elected president in American history. Not that JFK preyed much on Oswald's mind that year. No sooner had he decided to leave Minsk than he found a reason to stay. In mid-March 1961, Oswald met Marina Prusakova by chance at a trade union dance. Well, it was supposedly by chance. Marina's uncle worked for Soviet intelligence, and it's long been suspected that he engineered Marina's meeting with the American. Regardless, the two hit it off, and a mere 6 weeks later, on April 30th, 1961, they got married. Barely 9 months later, on February 15th, 1962, Marina Oswald gave birth to their daughter, June. It was at this time that Lee Harvey Oswald began taking his return to the USA very, very seriously. Aware that finding work in America with an undesirable discharge hanging over him would be difficult, Oswald came up with a desperate plan. He wrote directly to Secretary of the Navy John Connally asking for his discharge to be scrubbed. In return, he merely got a glossy leaflet asking him to support Connally for governor of Texas. This was more than just a slap in the face. To Oswald's mind, it was like Connally had personally urinated on him and then seduced his mother. From that moment on, Oswald would begin nursing a grudge against Connally that would soon grow to murderous proportions. Undesirable discharge or not, though, the Oswald's family petitioned to return to the USA, it was gaining steam. It turns out Oswald had never surrendered his American citizenship, despite threatening to do so back in Moscow. When this came to light, there was little the Americans or Soviets could realistically do to keep their family in Minsk. On June 2nd, 1962, Oswald, Marina, and their baby daughter June all received permission to return to the US. They headed straight for Fort Worth, Texas, where they moved in with one of Oswald's brothers. Just like that, Oswald's career as a professional defector, it was over. He was now back in the land of the free, and it wouldn't be long before Oswald was using those freedoms to buy himself a gun. But you know what I think you should buy? Dollar Shave Club, because 1, it's awesome, and 2, because for just $5 you can get started with an amazing product and support this show. That's a win. I use Dollar Shave Club to shave my head, obviously not my beard. I used to use those cheap razors from the store. I'd always end up cutting myself. It was just a generally bad and bloody time, but I also didn't want to buy the super expensive ones that are wrapped in all the crazy plastic with all the security stuff. It was just bad choices, either expensive or crap. But then Dollar Shave Club comes along and they have quality without the crazy price tag. Just $5 at Dollar Shave Club gets you an executive razor, 3 tubes of shaving stuff, there's a scrub, shaving butter, and a post-shave dew. Also, they have an oral kit and a shower kit. Those are just $5 each as well if you want them. The toothbrush, it's great stuff. My old brush, I'd had it for way too long, months and months and months. The bristles, they were all, it doesn't matter, I got a new one from Dollar Shave Club. It's awesome. The shower stuff is also great too. But look, me, I'm a man with a big head to shave, and the razors are where it's at for me. So if you want to buy one thing from Dollar Shave Club, get that $5 razor kit, and then if you want, get the dental one, get the shower one as well. It's just $5 each. So just go to dollarshaveclub.com/biographics. Get started for just $5. If you've ever thought about supporting Biographics and what we do here, Dollar Shave Club, it's a really easy way to do that. So please go check it out. There's also a link below. So given Oswald's past, you're probably expecting to hear how his return to America was marked by the feds dragging him off for a lengthy interrogation. Not quite, though. While the FBI did check in with Oswald, the CIA didn't even bother to send anyone out to talk to him. That is, of course, unless you believe the theories that say that the CIA did debrief Oswald but then destroyed the evidence after JFK got shot in order to cover their tracks. Either way, come summer of 1962, Oswald was living in Texas and he was looking for a job. And this was not a happy search. Remember how we said his undesirable discharge might be a massive deal when looking for employment? Well, it turned out to be that absolutely massive deal. A great many places turned Oswald down after learning about his unhappy break with the Marines. According to people who knew him, Oswald responded to those setbacks by blaming the man who had refused to scrub his discharge, John Connally. But not even an undesirable discharge defector is completely unemployable. In October of 1962, a Minsk emigre friend of Marina finally got Oswald a job in Dallas. But there was something else that had caught Oswald's magpie mind by this time, and that was Cuba. That fall, Oswald began to obsess over Castro's new Cuba. He started to tell people that Kennedy was a terrible president for authorizing the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, a bungled attempt to overthrow Castro. It was at a Dallas party in February of 1963 that Oswald aired these views to one Volkmar Schmidt. Schmidt snorted and told Oswald that he should be far more angry at Edwin Walker. An ultra-rightist, Walker had been forced to retire his post as a general for teaching his soldiers fascist ideas. Something about Walker's story caught Oswald's imagination. He began to stalk the former general, and not long after, he ordered a pistol and rifle through the mail. Marina was home late at night when Oswald came bursting through the door, white as a sheet, babbling that it shot him. Him was Edwin Walker. Less than an hour earlier, a single bullet had come through Walker's window, just missing the ex-general. The shot had been fired by Oswald, who'd buried the rifle and fled the scene, convinced that it killed Walker. It was only when Marina turned on the radio that Oswald realized that it missed. Not 2 weeks later, Oswald, he vanished from Texas. And this is where we get into the really mysterious part of Lee Harvey Oswald's life. We know he eventually resurfaced in New Orleans, but the timeline of what he did there is all confused. Proponents of the theory that the mafia killed Kennedy believe Oswald spent his time in New Orleans getting connected to the mob via his uncle Charles Marriott. Regardless of whether or not that's the case, we do know he took a minor job at a coffee company and sent for Marina and June to join him. But all of this was just a sideshow. Oswald's real interest in New Orleans was Cuba. That May 1963, Oswald founded a pro-Castro group, handing out leaflets in the street and trying and failing to recruit new members. Yet he seems to have been playing some sort of game. In August, Oswald approached an anti-Castro group and offered his services. The group turned him away. Still, Cuba remained a powerful draw in the young man's mind. He appeared on local radio twice to defend the Castro regime. In September, he told Marina he was planning to hijack a plane and fly it to Havana. Eventually, this strange dream completely consumed the dreamer. On September the 25th, Oswald vanished from New Orleans just as suddenly as he had vanished from Dallas. His exact movements that night are unknown. Years later, an anti-Castro activist in Dallas would recall a man named Leon Oswald showing up on his doorstep and asking for money to help the guerrilla war against Castro. The activist refused. Regardless, we know exactly where Oswald was by mid-morning the very next day. He was on a bus bound for Mexico City, and he had a plan that would make his defection look like a mere warm-up act. At the height of the Cold War, there was no more shadowy city in the Americas than Mexico City. Officially, Mexico was neutral. Unofficially, it was a hotbed of clandestine meetings, dangerous games, and spies gunning to get the drop on one another. Into this setup for a Graham Greene novel walked one of the most shadowy men of them all. Lee Harvey Oswald arrived in the Mexican capital on September the 27th after an all-night bus journey. Barely had he dumped his bag in the hotel room than he was making for the Cuban embassy. Oswald had made up his mind. He was going to defect to Cuba. Alright, so you might remember how initially the US was like, yeah, we're really not interested, dude. Well, Cuba, they were even more like, yeah man, just no. Rebuffed, Oswald went to the Soviet embassy and tried to get a transit visa through Cuba, presumably hoping to defect when he landed. But again, the Soviets were like, it's not happening. So Oswald went back to the Cubans. He literally begged them to take him, but they refused. Broken, Oswald left the Cuban embassy. 5 days later, he was on a bus back to Dallas, his shiny new dream in tatters. At least, that's the official version. The unofficial version comes from reports by CIA assets in Mexico City when Oswald arrived. They paint a very different picture. The spy June Cobb reported Oswald had been spotted at a party attended by Cuban diplomats. While there, he was overheard joking about killing JFK. Another asset claimed to have seen Oswald at a separate party conversing with two Americans. These two men, they've never been identified. It's pretty spooky stuff. Now, whether you believe the official or unofficial versions, there's no denying that Oswald was back in Dallas by October the 3rd. Exactly 2 weeks later, he took the job at the Texas School Book Depository. From this point on, the story of Lee Harvey Oswald takes on a feeling of inevitability. On October the 20th, Marina gave birth to Oswald's second daughter. Just 3 days later, Oswald clandestinely attended a right-wing rally being held by Edwin Walker, the general he'd tried to shoot. On November the 1st, the FBI came knocking at Marina's door. She was living with a friend after a row with Oswald and was surprised to discover the feds wanted to talk with him. When word reached Oswald, he became jumpy. On Tuesday, November the 19th, a local Dallas paper published the route the president's motorcade would take through the city on Friday. Oswald noted that the car would pass right by his place of work. He also noted that Governor John Connally would be riding along with the president. Finally, on November the 21st, Oswald went to the house of the friends that Marina was staying with. Incidentally, the same place had left his rifle for safekeeping. That evening, he tried to make up with Marina 3 times. Each time, Marina refused. Oswald wound up spending the night in the garage, his rifle beside him. And that was how things stood as the clock ticked towards midnight and November the 22nd, 1963, officially began. President Kennedy was on his way to Dallas, and Oswald was just a nobody who dreamed of being a somebody. In just over 12 hours, that dream would become a nightmarish reality. The morning he entered the history books, Lee Harvey Oswald woke up early, removed his wedding ring, and left some money alongside the sleeping Marina. He wrapped his rifle in paper and took it with him to the 6th floor at the Texas School Book Depository. At noon, Oswald's fellow workers, they clocked off for lunch. He told them he would be right with them. Then he patiently waited until they'd all filed into the elevator and left before going back to retrieve his rifle. At 12:29 p.m., exactly as advertised, the presidential motorcade swung onto Dealey Plaza. As John F. Kennedy waved at the crowds, the wife of Governor John Connally leaned toward the president and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Those would be the last coherent words Kennedy would ever hear. As the clock ticked over to 12:30, there was a distant crack of a gunshot. If you watch the Kennedy footage carefully, you can see that Governor Connally heard the first shot. He reacts and starts to turn around, and then the entire sensible world shattered into a billion pieces. There was another crack. A bullet went through the president's throat and hit Governor Connally, causing him to slump forwards. In the car, Jackie Kennedy grabbed her husband, asking him what was wrong. Up on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald took aim with his rifle again. 5 seconds later came the third and final crack. President Kennedy's head jerked back with the force of the bullet, and the screen faded to black. The rest of that fateful afternoon, you already know. The images of panic in the streets are seared onto our minds. The sound of Walter Cronkite's voice disbelievingly telling the nation that President Kennedy is dead. You know, too, the way Oswald fled the scene only to shoot Officer J.D. Tippit dead less than an hour later. You likely remember the story of how Oswald tried to hide in a movie theater only to be arrested shortly after. At midnight that same day, Oswald was booked for assassinating the president and paraded before the press. It's only with hindsight that we can look at photos of that moment and notice Jack Ruby lurking in the background. By the time the clock ticked over and November the 22nd, 1963 receded into history, nobody on Earth had any doubt. In less than 10 seconds that afternoon, a single man had pulled a trigger and changed the world. The dream was over. Nothing would ever be the same again. After the drama of the previous day, Saturday, November the 23rd, 1963 was eerily quiet. In Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald sat in a police cell, protesting his innocence. Outside, a local strip club owner named Jack Ruby hung around, asking every cop he saw what time Oswald would be transferred to another jail. The only thing of note that really happened that day was the first broadcast of the long-running British sci-fi series Doctor Who, but we're going to guess maybe the people in Dallas were a bit too occupied to care about that. But if November the 23rd passed in stunned silence, November the 24th would be marked by the crack of another gunshot. At 11:17 a.m. that morning, Dallas police led Lee Harvey Oswald out into a waiting crowd to be transferred to another facility. No one noticed as Jack Ruby sauntered down the ramp towards the prisoner, murder in his eyes. No one noticed the revolver being raised, the sudden movement. There are photos you can find of the exact moment Oswald was shot. His mouth is wide open, his eyes bugging out of his head. The crowd of policemen, they look blandly at him, as if they haven't realized what is happening. Oswald collapsed into a pool of blood. As he was grabbed by police, Jack Ruby was heard to shout, "You guys couldn't do it. I did it for you. I had to show that a Jew has guts. I'm happy that I got him." Less than 2 hours later, at 1:07 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald was pronounced dead. And that's really the end of our story. There's simply no time here to go into the endless theories that grew in the wake of Oswald's own assassination, linking him to the Mafia, to the Cubans, to the Soviets, to the CIA. No time for the Warren Commission. No time to even check back in with Jack Ruby dying of cancer complications in his cell on January the 3rd, 1967, remorseless to the end. Perhaps the only thing we should mention is the little green book Secret Service agent Mike Howard found in Oswald's apartment, the one with a kill list written in it, and Governor Connally's name decorated with daggers. Of Kennedy's name, there was no sign. But even this is just a distraction from our main narrative. There are plenty of videos out there on the JFK assassination. If you want theories on who did what and why, they're only a click away. But our job today, it was to tell the story of not the conspiracy, but of the man at the heart of it. And that job is now done. Lee Harvey Oswald was laid to rest at Rose Hill Burial Park, Fort Worth, on November the 25th, 1963, the exact same day John F. Kennedy was interred at Arlington Cemetery. Finally, after 24 years of fruitless searching, Oswald had at last found his home. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that like button below. Also subscribe, but most of all, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Dollar Shave Club, at dollarshaveclub.com/biographics. There's also a link below. And as always, thank you for watching.